Given how beautiful it is outside, I take, Lyn, that this is a huge compliment to your scholarship and your much-deserved award. So welcome everybody to the Inaugural Professorial Lecture Series for Thompson Rivers University. I'm Lyn Baldwin, I'm the VP Academic and Provost. This is sort of a joint initiative between the Senate Research Committee and my office to recognize and to support faculty for their excellence once they become once they summit, as they say, the rank of full professor. So before we get started this evening, just wanted to honor that we are on the unceded and traditional territories of the Kamloops our first house. They are our hosts of our Kamloops campus, and as well as Tahulk, our second house, which hosts our Williams Lake campus. We're located on these ancestral lands, and from these lands we serve students and peoples from many nations. So, as I said, this is an inaugural series that has been recently created, and coming out of the pandemic, there was a number of successes that were going unrecognized, and we've been playing catch-up ever since we've been allowed to come together again. And so we've been spending some time, for those of you who have attended previous lecture series, but we've been spending our time celebrating and acknowledging the accomplishments of our newly minted full professors here at TRU. So this is the largest gathering that we've had so far this evening. So again, congratulations, Lyn. That's sort of, again, another testament to the incredible gift of the scholarship that we'll hear more about this evening. So this lecture series is really a way in which universities typically will publicly celebrate this remarkable milestone in the careers of academics. The promotion to full professor is a very rigorous process. Academics seem to like to do that to themselves. Every few years they like to sort of prove that they are in fact engaging in rigorous scholarship and quality pedagogy in the classroom. And so it's an applicant's research, teaching, and service that is thoroughly evaluated by not only peers within the institution, but also is sent out into the international arena where there is peer review that happens there as well. And so TRU usually promotes between 4 to 8 faculty members to full professor each year. And typically these lecture series are intended to be a bit of a celebration of the journey that it takes to get here, to really get to know deeply the complexity and the curiosity of our faculty members' research, and to really celebrate their contributions to knowledge overall. And I would say that it's a well-known fact that women in particular in the academy are seldom encouraged to seek promotion to full professor. We often face unique barriers, such as beliefs of our own that our work is not quite good enough, it's not quite scholarly enough, and we don't really need to do that anyway. So tonight, Lyn, as a scholar whose contributions have changed how we study the natural world, is in fact very deserving of that recognition. So these events are important to us at TRU because they demonstrate to the community and to the Kamloops community that faculty have earned the respect of their peers worldwide for the impact of their work. They demonstrate a professor's own commitment to research and teaching and acknowledge the contributions that collaborators, peers, and students and colleagues have made to their careers. So this brings us together in a really important way to celebrate all of these things. And so tonight's event. So, Lyn Baldwin's topic, the unquiet botany, reconciling plants and people with story and image. Lyn was promoted to professor in April of 2022 and has illustrated a selection of her stories through her field journal and art, and will read an excerpt from her forthcoming book, Drawing Botany Home, A Rooted Life. She will explore the colonial distortion of people's understanding of and relationship with plants. She explains how this plant blindness can be reconciled by learning not just about plants, but from them and through story, art, and science documented in field journals. Her research includes scholarship of discovery in plant ecology, the scholarship of teaching and learning, and the scholarship of integration. Her research has investigated applied questions around plants and their conservation, especially those plants living on spatial or temporal margins. She has used citizen science to help monitor the abundance of pollinator guilds within the South Thompson region, and she focuses on how using tools from outside science, including plant-based learning and the arts, can help students learn biology. Lyn's book comprises essays and illustrations she crafted out of nature. It explores the intricate relationship between society and the botanical world. There is also a book launch to be held on Wednesday, April 24th at the Exchange Community Collaborative Center at 4:30, for those of you who are interested to attend that event as well. And a last note, just to let folks know that this event is being recorded and it will be shared on YouTube for others to enjoy. And for now, I'd like to invite Dr. Nancy Flood from the Biological Studies Faculty of Science to introduce her colleague Lyn Baldwin this evening.
So I'm a lot shorter than this. How about there? It's more like, this is more for Kara and I, yeah. Okay, so you've stolen a little bit of my thunder there, Jillian, but that's okay. So we could have a naturalist club meeting right now if we wanted. Anyway, sorry, I digress. So we all know, or many of us here, I think, know that Lyn is a great teacher. As evidence of this, in 2022, she was awarded TRU's President's Distinguished Teaching Award and a West Coast Teaching Excellence Award from the BC Teaching and Learning Council. In 2018, she received national recognition in the form of the Desire to Learn Innovation Award from STILI, Canada's Society for Teaching and Learning in Higher Education. But even without those awards, you would know about her passionate and skilled teaching by talking to her students. From those who have gone on to do PhDs in plant ecology to those who really don't like plants much at all. And there are a few of those. And having spent a lot of time in the Faculty of Science and overlapped completely with Lyn, the last 4 of them as co-chair of the Department of Biological Sciences, I know that Lyn excels in the service category of her job as well, from sitting on Senate to serving on departmental and faculty committees, such as the chair of the Faculty of Science Indigenization and Decolonization Committee, and now being co-chair of the department. She pulls her weight there as well. But in this lecture today, she's going to tell us about some of the research part of her job. So let me set that up a little for you. Lyn describes her research, I've kind of sifted through it, as having actually 4 prongs. First, the scholarship of discovery. That's the sciencey stuff. Discovering new pieces, patterns, or processes related to plant ecology, especially mosses, Lyn's favorite. Then there is the scholarship of teaching and learning, SOTL for the cool cats in the crowd. That's how to get students to understand and appreciate that sciencey stuff. Spoiler alert, lecturing often doesn't work. Then there is the scholarship of application. That's using the sciencey stuff to make the world a better place, like working with community members to monitor the abundance of pollinators in this region and provide information that will allow us to maintain or increase these vital pollinator populations. The Bee Happy Garden at the end of the Leppen building is just one small piece of evidence of Lyn's work in this area. Finally, there's the scholarship of integration, which, as she describes it, is doing research on, quote, how using tools outside science, including place-based learning and the arts, can help students learn biology, end quote. And the arts include both literature, creative nonfiction, and painting and drawing, of course, not just one or the other. I don't know, I'm exhausted already. How about you? Lyn's CV is thus a full one. 2 books, 13 of those sciencey papers, 14 publications in literary journals, scientists like me might call those magazines, 2 books, and I've got that already, and 11 art exhibitions, along with lots of conference presentations in all of those areas. And added to all that, there's another really big bunch of publications and presentations, including 7 as an invited and/or keynote speaker on teaching. Lyn is a champion of SOTL on this campus, having been part of a dedicated cadre of folks who have elevated it to the point where it has become a respected field of research. She and these others inspire us to not just do our jobs, but to reflect on how we do them and to always strive to do them better. So imagine me co-teaching with Lyn. For example, our department's course on writing about biology, not in the stuffy sciencey ways we usually do, but creatively, so that we can appeal to and be understood by non-scientists like our mothers. Now, as my colleagues will tell you, I can spot a comma splice a mile away, and I really know what to do with a semicolon. But Lyn, I mean, come on. We use one of her pieces as a text for the course. And then there are the field courses I co-teach with Lyn, those that we teach out in the field or the forest or the marsh or the snowbank, depending on when and where and what we are teaching. In these, of course, students are required to keep, of course, I say, are required to keep illustrated field journals, documenting what they observe and learn in pictures as well as words. Of course, she doesn't ask for art as beautiful and as evocative as hers, but she demands that students really see, not just look at, nature, and demonstrate that seeing and learn it by illustrating it in some way. I can write complicated formulas on the board without even looking at my notes, but my artistic prowess extends to stick people or stick lizards, depending on the topic at hand. And when I try for something more dimensional, I have to explain what I've drawn, and people laugh. So this is what my PhD field journals looked like. I wish I'd had a teacher like Lyn when I was young. That's what Lyn's look like. So really, it's really hard for me to keep up. At least I've spent so much time with her I can help by finishing her legendary number of half sentences. Anyway, in many ways, therefore, Lyn drives me absolutely crazy. But as both a friend and a colleague, I love, appreciate, and respect her enormously. And it is my great honor to introduce her to you today. Phew, I made it. I thought I was going to. Okay, good.
My goodness. To say that I am overwhelmed is an understatement. Glenn, you're going to make my slide show up? What I want to do today is I'd like to report on a project that began about 15 years ago. And I think some of the words that have come before help situate this project, because sometimes I think the most important work of our life reaches out and grabs us before we even quite understand what is happening. And that's, in my experience, what happened to me. And this project has really reconfigured and reimagined my relationship with plants. But it started long before I completely understood why I might be wanting to do such a thing. But before I get into all of that, what I'd like to do is try to take the time to start this talk in a good way. First and foremost, none of what I will talk to you about today would have been possible without it being composted with the extraordinary privilege I've had to be a part of students' learning of botany, ecology, and natural history, many of whom are in this audience today, and I'm going to choke up about that. As you will see, some of the stuff I will talk about today ventures into fields in which I have no right exploring. My only formal degrees come in science, particularly plant ecology, but the work that I'm going to share with you has really grown through the extraordinary gift of the collaborators that I have had both here at TRU and away. These collaborators include artists, I'm looking at you guys, writers, bee fanatics, where's Elaine? She's back there. Bee fanatics, gardeners extraordinaire, as well as the biologists who I've had so much fortune to share a department with. Much of what I will talk about tonight has to do with stories I never thought I was really intended to find, but once found, stories need ways to be either heard or seen. And I want to acknowledge all of those people who have created the venues, whether they be art galleries, science museums, book publishers, as well as lecture series, including the Arts Colloquium and now this one, the Inaugural Professorial Lecture Series. I want to particularly note Douglas Booth for inviting me to present at this conference or this lecture. But most of all, I want to thank Wanda Cowles for all the work that she did putting something like this together. It's really been extraordinary, so thank you very much. The other thing that I want to acknowledge before I get on with the sort of meat of the talk, or the xylem of the talk, is that if stories need places to be told, then all storytellers come from somewhere. And I think in today's world, it's really important to acknowledge who we are and where we come from. I am a settler, born of orphans, one orphan by choice, the other not. My mother, Lynn Margaret Francis, don't touch the microphone, was born to a settler family who fled the urban poverty of London in the early 1900s. However, shortly after I was born, my mother divorced her family, and I was raised largely without elders. On the other side, my biological father was born to orphans who had immigrated first to Toronto and then to Vancouver. I have one daughter, Maggie, who now makes the 5th generation of my maternal line to live as an uninvited guest in the land that is now called the province of British Columbia. If I was raised without grandparents, my family's 1970s back to the land lifestyle meant I spent most of my childhood in these oversized gardens surrounded by sage and pine. All plants tell stories. Those we plant in our fields and our gardens, their stories are often packaged and discreet, portable. So it should come as no surprise that most of my childhood and even my early adulthood was spent in motion, shifting place and country with need or opportunity. And in 2004, against all odds, joining the professoriate here at TRU gave me the extraordinary gift of being able to return home to those piney forests and blue bunch grasslands I'd always held as the heart of home. And for the last 19 years, I've had the extraordinary privilege of living as an uninvited guest within Secwepemcúlecw. I think it is impossible for us to acknowledge all that we owe those who have stewarded this territory, including its plants, since time immemorial. I tell you this rather extended history for 2 reasons. First, because I'm very grateful to have learned from Gary Gottfredson, TRU's Secwepemc Cultural Advisor, that the proper way to introduce yourself in Secwepemcúlecw is to acknowledge both your ancestors and your descendants. However, I also share this history with you, with its truncated line of elders and all too easy mobility, because I believe it is emblematic of the time that we live in what many now call the age of humans or the Anthropocene. In 2004, when I returned to BC to take up teaching botany, I had only just begun to worry about my easy mobility, but I had not yet learned to fear the Anthropocene. I had not yet, as many of you in this room now have, lived in a world that raged with wildfire, whose atmospheric rivers washed away not just one highway, but a whole series of highways. I had not lived in a world whose relentless human mobility initiated a global pandemic. In 2004, if I thought about the relationship between plants and people, it was really only to worry about what we people did to plants. Certainly, I had no idea of how much of the Anthropocene's infrastructure had been built on the relationships some people had been cultivating with plants for the last 500 years. Some of this is just the numbers. It's just flat. See, Nancy, there's numbers somewhere. Some of it was just the numbers. By biomass, plants make up nearly 80% of the terrestrial world. And in the Anthropocene, we humans are the greatest evolutionary and geologic force on the face of this blue planet. We may rely on plants for food, pharmaceuticals, fiber, and fuel, but many now argue that the relationship that some of us have with plants is at best lopsided and at worst violent and extractive. The famed botanist and citizen of the Powhatan tribe, Robin Wall Kimmerer, has eloquently argued that if we're willing to accept the gifts of plants, at the very least, we owe them our attention. She writes that it's a sign of respect and connection to learn the name of someone else. It's a sign of disrespect to ignore it. Naming plants, says Robin, is just good manners. However, for nearly 25 years, botanists have been moaning the prevalence of what they call plant blindness throughout our society. And so today, in honor of both where and when we are, I want to allow me to draw our collective attention towards one of our green neighbors. Of course, where we are is in Secwepemcúlecw. When we are is just a few hours after the spring equinox. In English, this green neighbor of ours is known as sagebrush buttercup, and its range sprawls across the western montane grasslands of western North America. Of course, this plant's relationship with its peoples far predates the arrival of English on its range. For the Statlium, these plants were called spring salmoni and used as phenological indicators to indicate the return of Chinook salmon in the Fraser River. Other people knew that the whole plants could be used to poison their arrowheads or even as a poultice for warts. As a conservation biologist, I worry deeply about plant blindness. How, after all, can we protect what we can't even name? But I have also come to realize that names are never neutral. Names can both identify and they can also obscure. In my discipline, the science of botany, the only names that are recognized are those that are tied to a published description of the plant as well as to a physical collected specimen. The scientific name of this plant is Ranunculus glaberimus and is based on a description that was written by William Jackson Hooker in 1840, just 1 year before he was appointed director of the Royal Botanic Garden at Kew. Today, we can find versions of this description online. This, written in Latin, this defining description of an entire species makes no mention of people's prior relationship with these plants. This description, in fact, was written by a man who never once set foot on Turtle Island, who certainly never came to Secwepemcúlecw. Only near the end of this description does Hooker acknowledge the hands that had brought this plant to his attention. He says, "I have seen it in no collection but that of the indefatigable Douglas." And of course, the indefatigable Douglas was none other than David Douglas, a Scottish plant collector largely in the employ of the London Horticultural Society. Douglas did come to Turtle Island. He did come to Secwepemcúlecw, traveling through here in the spring of 1833 while seeking a ship home from Fort Simpson on the north coast. You know, today, as a botanist working in the Anthropocene, I have a hard time knowing how to think about Douglas. This was a man, on one hand, who knew his plants. he identified, the best estimates I can find, at least 240 species new to European science. Certainly, it's without doubt that the collection of seeds and cuttings he sent back home to London forever changed the course of European horticulture. Douglas fir now grows all over Europe because of Douglas. We know that the scientific specimens that Douglas made, including the one that Hooker used to name sagebrush buttercup, the value of these specimens scientifically is immense. Preserved in the Kew herbarium for more than 200 years, this specimen is but one of more than 390 million herbarium specimens that botanists have collected, isolated, and preserved in the world's herbarium. Collectively, these specimens are used to track everything from climate change, pollution, remediation, changes in species diversity, even extinctions. On the other hand, these types of specimens and the men, mostly men, who collected them were clearly part of the European project to name and claim the world for their own advantage. Douglas was just one in a long series of collectors who had crisscrossed the ocean on ships. The tracks of these ships, digitized in this image by geographer Ben Schmidt's digitization of 18th and 19th century shipping logs, the tracks of these ships are so numerous as to clearly outline the world's land masses. Botanists like Douglas were not just bioprospecting for species new to European science. They were bioprospecting for species that they could collect and replant elsewhere as economic crops. This collection and subsequent reshuffling of the world's flora is part of what historian Alfred Crosby called the Columbian Exchange. It's hard today to overstate the ecological and cultural consequence of the Columbian Exchange. If this exchange started with the search for new or novel plants, it did not end there. As we all now understand all too well, when we humans travel, our diseases travel with us. Packed in alongside crops and livestock, Europeans brought measles, smallpox, typhus, and cholera to the New World, with catastrophic results for the America's indigenous populations. As many of you in this room know, estimates indicate that anywhere from 70 to 90% of America's population perished in the wake of European arrival. 50 million people perished. And the consequences did not end there. Geographers now argue that this massive reshuffling of the world's botany actually allowed farmers to pick the right crop for the right place, such that the resulting increase in harvested calories actually helped support Europe's growing population and industrialization. So much so that historian William McNeill has pointed out the important role that potatoes, or lowly potato spuds, in combination with guano imported from Peru, together potato and fertilizer, McNeill says, basically led to empire. McNeill writes that potatoes, by feeding rapidly growing populations, permitted a handful of European nations to assert dominion over most of the world between 1750 and 1950. By the mid-1800s, the Americas had become the place for many of these new Europeans, including my own ancestors, to go. Pulled by abundant resources and the need for their labor, it's estimated that 60 million Europeans sailed west across the ocean. 60 million bodies carrying seeds and stories, hopes and habits. The extraordinary Swilex poet and scholar Jeanette Armstrong has a poem that speaks to what the arrival of these 60 million bodies must have looked like. And I'll just excerpt a few of her stanzas. Armstrong writes, "Out of the belly of Christopher's ship, a mob bursts, running in all directions, pulling furs off animals, shooting buffaloes, shooting each other left and right. Pioneers and traders bring gifts, smallpox, Seagrams, and Rice Krispies." If my settler and academic ancestors were part of what burst out of ships, some, like poet and philosopher Tim Lilburn, has wondered if they ever really arrived, or did we, in traveling too fast, in carrying seeds and stories from the old country, did we limit our ability to actually attach to the ground underfoot? Certainly, all available evidence indicates that the botany that we are involved in every single day is still profoundly haunted by its colonial legacy. If we zoom from the world into that extraordinary confluence that sits at the heart of Kamloops, it's clear that many gardens, including my own, not only root in contested territory, but they're inhabited by species that are selected more by the Columbian Exchange than by soil and climate. During the COVID lockdown, the 125 different plants that I counted in my garden, of those 125, only 12 were growing here at the time that Douglas traveled through Shekwekmekulu. Of course, our grocery stores and even our spice stores are filled with plants collected from a globalized botany. And the issue is not that we collect from the world. People from time immemorial have been trading plants across the borders. But for the last 500 years, we have privileged some plant species over others to such an extent that now today, actually I think this paper is about 10 years old, but the croplands that we cultivate and the pastures and rangelands that we cultivate, croplands in sort of dark orange and pastures and rangelands in the greenish yellow, collectively, these planted areas form one of the world's largest terrestrial biomes, occupying nearly 40% of the land's surface. Is it any wonder that authors Ross Gray and Sheila Sheik write, "Plants are the most instrumentalized of all forms of life, degraded and overlooked. Rethinking our relationship with them must be understood as part of a wider rethinking of our relationship with each other." And then in 2003, the great Tom King wrote, "Want a new ethic? Tell a new story." But how does someone like me, a settler scientist, learn new stories when we come to understand our first stories are no longer serving the needs of everyone? It can't be through science alone. According to its etymology, the function of science is to cut or split. Today, few believe that science alone is sufficient to restore a reciprocal relationship between the world's plants and people. Yet, if science demands that its practitioners stay at an objective distance, many argue that art has practices within it that demand the intimacy of close attention and prolonged observation. In his discussion of drawing as discovery, the artist and critic John Berger argues that drawing forces the artist into an extended understanding, or to test our understanding of whatever it is we are drawing. He writes that the prolonged drawing, during prolonged drawings, each confirmation or denial brings you closer to the object until finally you are, as it were, inside it. The contours you have drawn no longer marking the edge of what you have seen, but the edge of what you have become. Certainly, according to its etymology, the function of art argues that it works to fit things together or join. So, I have no formal degrees. You heard them read that litany of things I've done. None of them include an art degree. But as a botanist, I was trained in the use of field journals as a way of learning plants. And entries in these field journals range from simple line drawings of individual species or of descriptions of species habitats. And this is where I say this project began without me even knowing it. And the work in these journals sort of reached up and grabbed me at one point. Because no matter the entry, whether it was on the margin of an alpine lake or whether it was between the rows of an urban garden, the work that I was doing in these journals, with their implicit mix of both art and science, with line and image, story and word fragment jostling side by side, I realized that the practice within these journals had developed into something that could transform an anonymous map like this into a map that was populated by moments in time where I was gifted with the opportunity to not just learn about, but to learn from plants. The first one that I want to share with you, you don't have to travel far to locate where I was when I learned this lesson. If you just go west of town, out to where the Trunkhill and Thompson rivers enter into the Kamloops Lake, this is where I learned waters rise at Trunkhill. In March, when the rivers run low and tree buds clench tight, this land hungers for water. You can feel it in the dry crunch of leaves underfoot, in the orange longing of willows stranded above the water's edge. You can read it in the spread of sediment beyond the bank. This is the land that water built, a place where the Thompson and the Trunkhill rivers flood free, a place where beavers rework hydrology and buds break first. Embryonic flowers and leaves slip free of winter's harness, pulled by hormones, called by light. Each species cracks differently. Cottonwoods burst open, red for male, green for female. In both shrub and tree, water rushes upward, spilling into bud cells. This is the way of water. Little things, weighted by gravity, drawn by tension, build into big things, forming a taut bow of intent, while beneath it all, eagle feathers lay abandoned. The next story or lesson that I want to share with you occurred not far from where the Trunkhill and the Thompson enter into the Kamloops Lake. If you follow the Trunkhill river up into the upper grasslands, you'll come to a place that students and I have learned to call Botany Pond. And this illustrated essay is now chapter 15 in this book, Drawing Botany Home. And actually, before I start reading, I want to say that this essay really reflects my attempt to try to reconcile what it means to be a botanist collecting in the Anthropocene when I know the history about Douglas, when I know the history about what the Columbian Exchange has done to our world. So, with that, on a Sunday afternoon in middle March, I am once more headed into the place that the students and I call Botany Pond. Arriving, I open my truck door and step out into the high, thin light of a spring afternoon in the upper Lac du Bois grasslands. Around me, the hills are brown and muted from the weight of winter. I'm layering up hiking boots, downjacker, windbreaker, when my eyes drift skyward. There, perched on a whip-thin aspen, a raptor stares down at me. I reach back into the truck, one hand scrabbling for field journal, even as I bring binoculars to eyes. Knowing that my time with this bird will be shorter than I like, I make notes as fast as I can, willing my body to be a conduit, eye, brain, hand, page. The bird faces toward me, lighter than a red-tailed hawk, clear white belly, speckled breastband, dark tail, dark mask. As its head swivels away and then back, a hooked bill flashes past. And then it's aloft, broad wings, clearly a buteo and not a falcon. The bird cants through sky, a white band slicing across its tail until the nearby hill swallows it whole. My pencil stops, silence holds. And then starlings across the road chatter the day back into sound. Time regains its normal footing. Crossing the gravel road, I think about the moment I just shared with the hawk. I am different after having felt a raptor's glare skittering across and then dismissing my form. But even now, years after I first learned to hunger for such moments, I can't predict their occurrence. Other than putting myself in place, field journal in hand, I can do little to facilitate them. What I do know is that in the Anthropocene, collecting these moments feels like a kind of hope. Collections are often defined as groups of things, specimens, figurines, poems, or even field journals. Beyond this, the limits of collecting are surprisingly contentious. Some argue that collecting is a basic part of the human experience, a remnant of the foraging instinct found in all animals, and includes any gathering of objects. Others insist that collecting includes only the deliberate gathering of things of subjective value. And of those collections made with intent, some are temporary, many aspire for permanency. Yesterday, a research student, Dominic, and I spent the morning counting sagebrush buttercups on the hills just south of Botany Pond. Most we left in place, a few we collected. The data set we tabulated will add to our understanding of this species, the first to flower in this grassland. Yet even as we shook and shivered beneath passing snow squalls, I understood we were collecting more than just numbers. Last autumn, during unseasonably warm temperatures, I found sagebrush buttercups blooming in November. A whole hillside, 5 months too early, a full season out of sync, a yellow flag of the Anthropocene's growing unpredictability. After a winter of worry, yesterday's dataset reassured me. Today I woke needing more comfort. Collecting is never without risk. Sagebrush buttercup's Latin name, Ranunculus glaborimus, is based on a specimen collected near the Columbia River by David Douglas in 1826. In this grassland, sagebrush buttercups root in place, entangled with bacteria, pollinators, and seed dispersers. In their barium of Kew Gardens, the buttercup lives that Douglas collected nearly 200 years ago, their dried carcasses flattened and glued onto an individual sheet of paper, stack among other specimens in a metal case, intact but inert. It's hard for me to imagine the determined focus of botany's most famous collectors, yet author Yuval Noah Harari writes, over the course of his or her life, a typical member of a modern affluent society will own several million artifacts, from cars and houses to disposable napkins and milk cartons. If we all collect, isn't the question what collections we really want to shape our lives? As a practice, the science of plant collecting co-evolved with the European project to name and claim the world. And in doing so, its techniques transformed rooted beings into mobile specimens. For nearly 6 centuries, the tools and techniques of plant collections have remained largely consistent. Hand lens, digging tool, plant press, field journal, glue, mounting paper. David Douglas faced far greater challenges than I do in sourcing good paper, but he and I could have shared gear across the centuries. And for both of us, there's no doubt that collecting plants transformed our lives. Collecting gave Douglas, the son of a Scottish stonemason, reason to travel the world, to mix with the scientific elite of his time. Collecting gave me a profession, a way to return home. Like Douglas, I learned the craft of plant collecting from my elders, most often in the field. plant collecting, done as much with the body as with the mind, is a tradition handed down from one generation to the next, entangling people and place with specimen and convention. Maybe that's the reason the lessons of my teachers, along with their hopes and habits, return to me most frequently in the field, and none more than the most accomplished collector of my teachers, the late Dr. Wilf Schofield. Like most botanists, Wilf labeled each specimen he collected with a sequential number, recorded in his field book. This number was the numeric code that will forever link specimen to place, or at least to the abstraction of place Wilf recorded in his field book. Referred to affectionately as a garbage bagger, Wilf built the collection of non-vascular plants, those beautiful tiny mosses and liverworts, at the University of British Columbia into one of the world's largest. Collections never end, but collectors do. When Wilf died in 2008 at the age of 81, his own collection number had reached a staggering 128,619. And this was a number he assigned to a moss he gathered in the last summer of his life on an island way out west in the Aleutian archipelago. Numbered or not, every collection searches for something. In 1753, the Swedish botanist Carolus Linnaeus published what he believed at the time was a complete list of the world's plant in his book, Species Plantarum. In consistently referring to each species with a two-part name, think Ranunculus glaberianus, Linnaeus inadvertently created the linguistic infrastructure to support a globalized botany. But on this, the historians are clear. The intent of Linnaeus's collection was to acquire, but not to colonize. During Linnaeus's lifetimes, Europeans, still largely confined to their continent, had already developed strong appetites for plants grown elsewhere. Think coffee from Africa, tea and sugar from India, cinnamon from Sri Lanka, tobacco from the Americas. Linnaeus wanted to find the plants, either those native to Sweden or exotics that could grow in Sweden, to serve as substitutes for the plants his country was going into debt to acquire. Collecting for Linnaeus was not just a method to catalog the world's botanical diversity, it was a mechanism for Swedes to eat, drink, and smoke local. Botany, it turns out, has always been as much as a business as it is a science. With their continent home to only 12,000 of the world's 400,000 plant species, every trip abroad allowed European botanists to bring home new species. The European appetite for exotic plants quickly spread beyond what could be consumed, and by the early 19th century, collectors like Douglas were prospecting across continents for the plants that could fill European garden beds as well as their cabinets of curiosities. Loss haunts every collection, some more than others. Unlike tobacco, sugar, and rice, Europeans had little use for sagebrush buttercup outside their science or garden. This species was never collected into those brutal fields of forced labor called plantations. The productions of this plant's fruits never relied on radically simplified ecologies, the dispossession of millions of indigenous plants or peoples, or the displacement of millions of enslaved lives from one continent to another. Unlike potatoes, corn, or wheat, the shuffling of sagebrush buttercup plants across the globe never produced the caloric or monetary surpluses that helped fuel European population growth and the establishment of colonies across the world. If collecting some plants helped build the infrastructure of the Anthropocene, other collections have tracked its import. Linnaeus didn't create the world's first herbarium, but he sure thought every botanist should make one. And for the last 6 centuries, botanists have. I think about those hands that have selected, dug, dried, spread, glued, and continue to care for the 390 million specimens that are now collected in the world's herbarium. I think of those green lives, stolen from home, isolated from community, suspended into specimen, that still have enormous lessons to teach us about our world. Maybe it's just my bias, but I think that the wisdom of any plant collection extends beyond its specimens. Collecting, no matter the intent, necessitates that we venture out into the world of living, breathing green things. Walking past the buttercups that Dominic and I sampled yesterday, I know I will spend the rest of the day hunting for more moments like the one I shared with the hawk earlier. If I'm lucky, I'll walk back to my truck with a few pages of sketches in my journal. Yet others have recorded much of what I will observe in Botany Pond as one of BC's few protected grasslands and one that is located less than 20 kilometers from the university where I teach. This place has quite literally been poked by scientists of all stripes. Does my collection of plant stories from this place matter? In his biophilia hypothesis, E.O. Wilson argues that humans are biologically predisposed to pay attention to the natural world. But I think many of us never stay in place long enough for attention to transform into relationship. And maybe that's what makes my collecting at Botany Pond, field journal in hand, so compelling to me. This is learning unplugged, free range, year after year, across the lives of plants rooted in place. Today in Botany Pond, hawks soar and sagebrush buttercups bloom. Last summer, not far from here, I sat drawing beneath a Douglas fir tree and was perplexed by the repeated journeys of a red-breasted nuthatch from canopy to leaf litter to trunk. I diagrammed the behavior in my field journal, bird, tree, ground, until it finally dawned on me what I was missing. Many of you will already know this. Seeds. Together, tree and bird taught me about their own lives, the slow quiet of an August day that accompanies seed fall, the avian collection that anticipates winter's scarcity. Together, tree and bird became less individual species to name, more members of my community, and maybe even kin. Today, I've circled out across the rolling hills and then back toward a narrow string of aspen trees. I look down at my page. It's turned into a list of springtime happenings. First flowers beginning to bloom, first bluebirds fly-catching from the lower branches of an aspen tree, last ice still lodged on north-facing slope. This collection is open-ended, one that builds on observations made in years past, one that will call me back again and again. And truthfully, I no longer collect as much as I should, not scientifically. Since beginning this project to restore my relationship with my plants, my own collecting number has been stalled in the 3-digit range. It will be unlikely, I think, to ever exceed 4 digits. But I think we collect who we are all day, every day. If we're lucky, our collecting requires the talents that we have available. If we're really lucky, our collections challenge our understanding of not just what we collect, but how we see the world. Nothing allies us more powerfully with the more than human world than the lessons that we learn from them. Europeans like Douglas may have set off to explore the world, but their field records reveal that the relationship between the collector and the collected is never one-sided. Reread by historians, the notes and sketches, even paintings of these European travelers reflect that while these men may have left home with definite beliefs about the way the world worked, its imperialism and patriarchy, even its origin and aesthetics, their minds were, in the words of one art historian, in the process of becoming not fixed and certain. I think that like any skilled or creative practice, collecting transforms our understanding of who we are through a mutual entanglement of world and will. Driving home, hills roll by on either side. Around one corner, I spot a hawk, perhaps the same one I saw before, spiraling upward. I can't help but wonder what it's hunting. I glance over at my field journal. It's only a week old, but already its pages are filling. In a couple months, I'll add it to the stack that sits on my bookshelf. Years ago, when I set out to restory my experience with plants, I thought I understood the risks of my new collection, the unfamiliar terrain of art galleries, the inchoate terror of reading my words aloud to both strangers and friends. But in retrospect, it's clear how little I understood the potency of plants in place, the way that plants rich in meaning and memory can serve as a refracting mirror for our own lives. Little did I understand how the ecology of these grasslands, the shape of tree leaves, the layered possibility of a peatland would entangle with the hard bits of my own history, the choices I make today. Perhaps that's the real power of collections. The way they begin to answer the questions we've yet to find the courage to ask. I know that the intent of my collecting has diverged from that of my elders. In multiple herbaria, more than half of the type specimens, those specimens that botanists use to define entire species, more than half of these specimens have been collected by just 2% of their collectors, the heavy hitters like Wilf. Collecting for stories means that little of what I collect can be deposited in herbarium. But no collection has mattered more to me than my first art show. That January night, the show opened in Kamloops' historic courthouse gallery. All of its images, botanical or otherwise, celebrated home. All of its images, big or small, were encased in the shadow boxes, dovetailed and elegant, handcrafted by my husband from big leaf maple and poplar. Years later, I still meet strangers who know too much about me from this exhibit. Maybe it's not what we collect, but what our collection does that matter. In science, collect means to gather systematically. In the Catholic and Anglican churches, a collect is a prayer offered up at a certain time. I wonder if both aren't a kind of listening, a way of attending. Maybe the best collections are those that make us open and porous to the world. And maybe in the new, unpredictable world of the Anthropocene, learning not just to collect, but to use image and story to listen and to learn from plants in their places is what I needed to do most. I will always treasure my memories of Wilf in the field, faded green slicker and rain pants cloaking his tall frame, worn canvas bag bulging with bryophytes slung over one shoulder, gray hair pushed awry by wind and rain, numbering up prayers, one by one, for the plants he loved. I will remember Wilf's collection numbers as marking both scientific specimens and moments of hope. I think Wilf, and maybe Douglas before him too, listened best when depositing herbarium specimens. I know I listen best when the world grips me as tightly as a hawk clutches a freshly killed vole. A sorted collection is no miscellany. It is a physical manifestation of what we know to be true and important. Today, driving the last curves of the gravel road home from Botany Pond, I understand the collection that has allowed me to make sense of my own life, that has reimagined my own botany, is the collection of field journals standing quiet and inert on the bookshelf. No wonder the current volume comes with me everywhere. I hope that this essay, Collecting the Grip, explains my understanding why the intimate practice of field journaling may have completely re-altered the intent of my botany. But there's an easy question. Why does this matter to anyone else but me? It matters, I think, because from space, our planet may look blue, but the world is green. And all of us, whether we acknowledge it or not, are embedded in relationship with the world's plants, both here and away. Anthropologist Natasha Myers has written, "Plants are the world makers we need to heed if we hope to grow livable worlds. If allying ourselves with plants, making space for them, is as critical to surviving the Anthropocene, then our attention to them is far more than just good manners." But not just any kind of attention. If we really are to make kin with the green inhabitants of this world, our attention, I believe, must be cultivated through sustained and intimate practices, and that can occur through gardening or drawing, gathering, or even collecting. These practices, however, also must acknowledge the stories who have known our green neighbors the longest. Drawing botany home may have taught me, a settler scientist, that home is never just a place on a map, but that it's a practice. But it's also critical that I acknowledge that the land and the plants that have supported my family, that have helped raise my daughter, have been defended by the Secwepemc people since time immemorial, that the people of this territory have and continue to resist colonialism, whether it's on scarred pipeline corridors, in courtrooms, or in front of the United Nations. And for those of us who call Secwepemc Ulu home, isn't it time we joined them in whatever way we can? Let me be clear. The risks are considerable, both to plants and to people. It takes courage to learn the names, to fall in love with our green kin, when estimating their extinction rates has become, in the words of one botanist, almost an obsession. But really, what other choice do we have? In the Anthropocene, the world changes at breathtaking rates. Other than the small planet we ride upon, there is no ark large enough, there is no vault deep enough to preserve the extraordinary diversity that is found in the living bodies of this world. Right here, right now, between spring equinox and summer solstice, the botany of this valley, if we make space for it, if we ally ourselves with it, will rise up in a wild, extraordinary roar of botanical reproduction. And so I'd like to end this talk with one small story, one more field painting about this roar, about this wild, extraordinary roar, because I believe in this wildness lies the preservation of the world. This field journal painting is called June's Roar. In grassland, in June, the roar of reproduction is everywhere. It's in the squadron of mosquitoes marshaling around my exposed skin. It's in the rounded shape of fungal paracells and the extraordinary flood of floral pigments. This grassland tangle of limb and tissue is the only reservoir of the land's memory. And each year, it is the roar rising again that safeguards and transforms the biochemical knowledge of what works, preserved in the gene pool of cranes and coyotes and geraniums and butterflies, and you and me. This cache of DNA is priceless. Down in the valley, water floods through channels of sand and silt and gravel. Up here, life floods through living tissue. This is the roar. Don't hesitate. Thank you very much.
Well, that was, I'm still processing. So just to keep us on track for the evening, I just wanted to introduce another fellow scientists to the room, one of our newest actually to Thompson Rivers University, Dr. Kara Lefebvre, who is the Associate Dean Faculty of Science, if she could come and give a response, if one could, right? Yeah.
Wow, how about that? I should say, in the fall semester at the university that I just came from, we had the gift of hosting Robin Wall Kimmerer, and I can tell you, Lyn, it was no less thrilling to listen to what you just presented than it was to hear her. Sorry, we can't hear you. Yeah, that was special for Lyn. Here's the real comments. Hi, everybody. I was asked to prepare some comments in response to Lyn's work and to the lecture she just presented. So it has been said that our planet does not need more people who are successful by being hyper-specialized. And rather, the planet desperately needs more peacemakers, healers, restorers, storytellers, and lovers of all kinds. It needs people to live well in their places, people with moral courage, willing to join the struggle to make the world habitable and humane. So thank you, Lyn, for sharing that snapshot of your work, a beautiful literal illustration of the integrated learning and storytelling that helps us to connect to our sense of place, wherever that may be. Your approach to your work highlights the heightened understanding that comes from the blending of science and art, from bridging across human-defined disciplines to explore and come to know and revere and ultimately protect both biological and cultural diversity. So we heard a little bit about this earlier tonight. A key trait that defines a full professor is evidence of excellence and leadership across all their spheres of scholarly activity. As a body of work, Dr. Lyn Baldwin's contributions demonstrate this so clearly. With her work in terms of discovery of new knowledge about regional plant communities, with her integration across disciplines that shed light on a bigger conservation context, with her application of science to challenges like invasive species, and with her creation of new knowledge about teaching and learning to explore what works in and out of the classroom. So that's the academic speak version of it, right? Through her scientific publications and her literary essays and her artistic works, Lyn instills better appreciation of the role of plants in nature and human society. But as Nancy pointed out, nothing provides a better testament to the enduring power of her work than the direct words of her students. What I've learned in a short time of being here is that they love her for her lasting impact on their lives. In nominating her for a teaching award, one of many supportive student voices said, if you were to ask me who had the biggest impact on my perspective of the world, so not just studies, but perspective of the world, I can answer with certainty that person is Lyn Baldwin. Another said, I struggled to fit in, but Lyn made it so that I felt safe participating. After my first course with her, my performance in every other course improved, as she made me feel more empowered of my own learning. And finally, through refreshing teaching methods, I learned the particulars of plant function, anatomy, and their relation to human beings, but also how to see the world around us through a new lens. So no surprise, guess what? She won that award. Congratulations, Lyn, on your forthcoming book and your achievement of the richly deserved rank of professor. Thank you for your efforts to make a kinder world that is more aware. You are a powerful example that scientists caring about the very thing that they study, along with how they do so, is perfectly okay and desperately needed.
I think that's what we all want to do right now. That is the end of our presentations on the stage this evening. Thank you for joining us. There's refreshments at the back. Lyn is here. There's lovely artwork on display. Please stay and enjoy each other's company. Thanks.